So I'm going to ask two questions, and I'm going to use the second question to really answer the first question. And the two questions are, is peace a possibility in the Middle East? And why is it that throughout history, the way we remember the Middle East is very, very, very much different than how we remember the Middle East today? Right? What do you think about immediately when somebody says Middle East? Think about terrorism, war, conflict, corruption, killings, oil dependency. But historically and even culturally, that's not what you think about when you think about the Middle East. Let's take food. Think about Middle Eastern food. It's luxurious. The food has a lot of like saffron, which is more expensive than gold. Think about Middle Eastern decoration. It's this nice, very beautiful, very delicate decoration. It's luxurious. Think about Persian carpets. Again, luxurious. Think about Turkish delights. This is sophisticated kind of industrial candy which has existed for hundreds of years. Or when you go to Starbucks, the tradition of going to a coffee house and relaxing comes from North Africa and the Middle East, right? Throughout history, the Middle East has been known for wealth, prosperity, and innovation. For most of the past 4,000 years, the Middle East has been technologically one of the very, very most advanced parts of the world. Actually, the Middle East and China have been the technological superpowers of the world for many thousands of years. But now we think about terrorism, war, and killing. And now nobody really even believes that peace in the Middle East is a possibility. But I do, and I have the solution. And the solution has nothing with a detailed plan on how to solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or how to, in practice, go and have a diplomatic negotiation between Iran and Saudi Arabia. What I will do is just put a vision of peace in the Middle East, and the vision will be and can be accomplished through trade. Because the Middle East is all about trade. And in a much deeper, sophisticated way than we today believe. So the problem is that we today believe that enterprise is a new European invention. And this perception is completely wrong. Enterprise is not a new invention, and it is not a European invention. The first enterprises of the world emerged in ancient Babylonia and in ancient Assyria 4,000 years ago. So in the countries we now know as Iraq and Syria, the first enterprises were born, the first entrepreneurs, the first advanced commercial networks, the first venture capitalists, the first early banks, the first production of goods for export markets. And of course, enterprise and trade fosters peace. Europe, people were killing each other in the First and Second World War. How did you get peace? Well, after the First World War, they attempted to economically push down the Germans, right? Said we'll weaken them. Well, that just triggered them to become even more aggressive. You got an even more, aggressive Germany coming at the rest of Europe in the Second World War. Then after the Second World War, people said, wow, this doesn't work. Let's foster trade. And Europe, which had so much killing, became peaceful. Through the trade. Trade works. Trade is the only solution for peace in history. The diplomats will always say, we created peace, but trade is what creates peace. In all of human history, there is really no exception. And trade really comes from the Middle East, and the concept of enterprise and voluntary market exchange evolved there 4,000 years ago. And for the most part of these last 4,000 years, the Middle East has been the marketplace of the world. I would like to say that enterprise and a market-based economy and voluntary exchange seemingly evolved also independently in China and India. And then these three traditions of Eastern market economy went together in the Silk Road. And if you know anything about history, you'll know that once Europeans got access to the Silk Road, Marco Polo, he became a superstar in Europe just by the fact that he traveled and saw the Silk Road. like 1,000 years ago. All of Europe was just marveling at this because, of course, the great civilizations of the Middle East, China, India, were so much more advanced than Europe at the time. And Marco Polo and other Italians kind of took the Eastern tradition of enterprise, made it their own, and then we got the modern market economy evolved in Italy. Now you might say, why should I care? Well, this made Europe rich. This created a renaissance. This made Europe enlightened, right? So you should care. The Babylonian astronomers would write down the market prices in Babylon. We have them. We have these sources. Today we know how the market prices of ancient Babylon changed for different goods between 1 month and another, and even during a month. So it was really a market-based economy, and it was extremely prosperous. Later, cities like Aleppo, Mosul, Baghdad, and the Iranian island of Hormuz would become these market centers of the world. Now think about Aleppo. What do you know about Aleppo? It's bombed, it's destroyed, right? Well, Aleppo, just a few hundred years ago, was where the world market prices were set. The bazaars of Aleppo are so big that modern tourists are astonished by them. Modern tourists who are living in this modern world with these huge malls are astonished by how big these bazaars are. Imagine, these bazaars were more or less the same size 1,000 years ago. Mosul used to produce very, very fine fabric. And both in English and in French, a word for very fine fabric is mousseline. Hormuz, Europeans went there a few hundred years ago, and they were like, wow, these Iranian merchants, how many goods do they have? And what is the quality of their metalworks? And Baghdad is a continuation of Babylon. So what happens like when Islam comes is that there's an invasion of Persia, and the Iranian culture, which was very entrepreneurial at the time, there was a market renaissance, mixes with the Arab culture, which was very, very enterprising. And then in the early Middle Ages, we get a revival of the Middle Eastern market tradition. And this is just astonishing because a lot of the development that we are taking part of comes from that. Modern agriculture comes from there. The industrialization begins there. The industrialization does not begin in Europe. The industrialization with water mills and windmills begins there, and then the continuation of this is the industrial revolution that we know of. But of course, our understanding of business and economical achievement is very much focused on the last few hundred years when this shifted from the Middle East to Europe. And we just completely forget all of the rest of these 4,000 years, which is wrong because the Middle Eastern tradition was peaceful. Market exchange, voluntary market exchange created peace. And we at least need to recognize this to pave the way for a peaceful vision of the Middle East. Just by remembering that this part of the world used to be the marketplace of the planet for so many thousands of years. So with this development came a lot of technological advancement. I love to compare the Middle East to Egypt. You know, Egypt was a very, very early human civilization, but Egypt didn't contribute that much to human progress. I think one of the reasons is that Egypt was centrally planned. Take the pyramids. Everybody is fascinated by the pyramids, and they say, who built them? I mean, if we today try to build the pyramids, we could, but it's very difficult. So people say maybe the aliens built them. Maybe there was some fantastic use from the pyramids. I will tell you the secret of the pyramids. People built them and they are nice but useless. This is the biggest government waste in human history. For hundreds of years, this magnificent civilization was centrally planned. So the guy, the pharaoh in charge says, I want a mountain built for me. And I want it to be mathematically super correct. I want it to be facing the North Pole perfectly. I want blah, 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 blah. And the next guy built a better pyramid. And they were just putting all of this human labor, all of this economic achievement into building these man-made mountains. In the Middle East, we have instead the true wonder of the ancient world, which you haven't heard of. I'll bet none of you have heard of it. So I'll show it to you. The Qanats. Has anybody heard of a Qanat? Somebody had, oh my God. So let me tell you this. One of you, or three of you come with me. We'll go to a place which is barren. There is no water. And I say, okay, first step, we will find an underground water source. Then we will build a channel to take this underground water a few kilometers until it comes to land. Then we get water. We have to dig a channel which has a precise angle. Like half a degree too high, half a degree too low. It won't work, it might collapse. We might die in that tunnel, and we have to dig a lot of vertical wells, otherwise we have no oxygen. Does this seem easy to you if I just give a shovel and a spade to you? Would any of you come with me? This is how the Middle East, large parts of the Middle East were made livable. This is why people not only lived along the Euphrates and Tigris, but like countries like Iran had a big population because they didn't build one of these channels. They built tens of thousands. And researchers have shown as late as the 70s, the 1970s, most of Iran's water came from the Qanats. And this invention, by the way, spread to China, to Rome, to many parts of the world. It is completely different than a pyramid because it's actually super useful, and it was not the government that built it, but market forces. Farmers, poor farmers would come together and say, you know what, we need land. So they would go to a group of entrepreneurs and said, build us a Qanat and we'll give you like a third of our harvest for 30 years. That's how they built them. And the government's role was only to ensure property rights were very strong. So yeah, the group of farmers who did this massive investment owned the land, which used to be barren. And this was actually an environmentally sustainable thing because they were also used to be paradisos. Have you heard the word paradise? Did you know that it comes from an ancient Iranian word paradiso, which means like a big garden, kind of like a natural reserve? Well, now you do. And the Qanats were feeding that. This thing, ancient Persia is interesting because a lot of people know it from the movies 300, which very accurately describes the ancient Persians as monsters who were killed by semi-naked Greek people. This picture is the Cyrus scrolls. Now, Cyrus the Great founded an empire which was very interesting. It's the only empire that held nearly half the world population. And it was a very inventive empire because it was the first empire based on tolerance. Instead of taking slaves, often they would free the slaves, as famously the Jewish people from slavery, which is noted in the Bible, of course. And once Cyrus took Babylon and freed the Jews from slavery, he wrote this declaration, the Cyrus Scrolls, a very early declaration of human rights. I'll just tell you quickly two other interesting things about this time. One of them is that we today believe that specialization on the marketplace, the invisible hand of the market, which is the basis for modern economy, this is something that comes when Adam Smith in the early modern age was writing The Wealth of Nations. Well, a historian has shown that no. Adam Smith himself was originally referring to a text from Xenophon who wrote about ancient Persia. Because the mechanism of voluntary exchange and the invisible hand of the marketplace was there in the ancient Persian Empire 2,500 years ago. And this is Cyrus the Great started the road, the King's Road, that was the beginning of the Silk Road. And he distributed the first standardized gold coins. It was all about trade. Instead of killing, the big empire was based on tolerance and trade. And this is no coincidence. There's a story again from Xenophon which says that when Cyrus was young, his teachers told him, listen, here's a case for you. Let's say a tall boy goes to the marketplace and exchanges something with a short boy. The tall boy forces the short boy to an exchange. Now, of course, that's bad, right? But they put a twist on the story. They say both of them benefit because the short boy gets a short tunic, the tall boy gets a long tunic. Cyrus, being a young prince, doesn't get it. So he says, yeah, that's cool. And his teachers beat him. They beat the guy who would be founding one of the biggest empires in human history and say you don't get anything because you as a king have nothing to do with whether an exchange is efficient or not. The only thing you have to consider is voluntary exchange and who property rights. So this idea that the king can't just go and say, no, I want that, you should do this. The king has nothing to do with this. Actually is not, again, something from modern Europe. It is from the ancient Middle East. And this matters because this is the foundation of the economic policies that create prosperity, and also that the rulers should respect people's property. Ancient Arabia, many people see ancient Arabia as a place of, I'm sure they were killing each other even more then. Ancient Arabia was very, very, very entrepreneurial. And this is because in ancient times, Europeans, like the Swedes, for example, they could have villages that were largely self-sustaining, right? But in Arabia, you don't have that much food, but you have a lot of valuable things. The 3 presents that were given when Jesus is born, incense, myrrh, and gold, all of them were produced in Arabia. And gold is mined, of course, but the others are kind of petrochemical products, which are pretty advanced and very, very useful in the ancient world. The Arabs had these very valuable products and they would trade with them. The Prophet Muhammad himself had an occupation. What was that occupation? Merchant. Who was his employer? His first wife, who is known as one of the most important figures in Muslim history, Khadija, who is the most important woman in Islam, was Muhammad's employer. She was a merchant capitalist. When her tribe went on for a business trip, they would go together for protection, everything. She owned half of the trade volume. One thing we know that the myriad of people who live in the Middle East, might be an Arab, might be an Iranian, Kurdish, Turkish, Armenian, Jewish, they have only one thing in common. They like conflict. No, I'm sorry. They have one thing in common. They are natural-born entrepreneurs and hagglers and dealers. If somebody tells you, my friend, let's do business, you don't know if the guy is Kurdish like me or Arab or Turkish or Jewish, but you know it's a Middle Easterner. And if you read the stories of 1001 Nights, who are the heroes? The heroes are entrepreneurs. It is a European tradition that the businessmen are the villains in the Hollywood movie. It is not a Middle Eastern tradition. We love entrepreneurship. We invented entrepreneurship. We love it. And the tradition of intellectual understanding of voluntary exchange, free markets, low taxes, it is not European. It was not Arthur Laffer who discovered that high taxes undermine the economy while he was eating dinner with Dick Cheney, the Laffer curve. Arthur Laffer is an intellectual. He says, no, I didn't invent this. Come on. Ibn Khaldun did. Ibn Khaldun, from the Middle Ages, a North African philosopher, invented much of modern economics, invented much of social sciences. This is really known. I'm not making this up, but it is not known because publicly people don't know this. You can read about this, but I want public awareness of the fact that enterprise, peaceful voluntary market exchange, and the ideals of economic freedom, individual liberty, very much come from the Middle East and also from China. Because trade is the only thing that creates peace in human history. Humans have 2 modus operatus. One of them is that we just go and kill the other tribe. The other is that we trade with them. We only have these 2 modus operatus. And Europe was a place where everybody was killing each other in the big world wars. Now you're just trading and are peaceful. And the Middle East, which has so much chaos and problems, well, for thousands of years, it was a marketplace of the world. If we can return to the trade, it's going to be peaceful. If you lock up a Jewish guy, an Iranian, an Arab in a room, they won't kill each other, they'll trade with each other. And I would just like to conclude my talk with saying that I know that sometimes Middle Easterners feel like Westerners look at us like aggressive fundamentalist terrorists, that we will take over the world with violence. That's not the case. We are entrepreneurs and we'll take over the world with business.